Megan, when you start the registration, Megan,
What?
when are you starting the registration?
The
The
registration?
recording, sorry, scusa, the recording.
Recording. The recording.
Recording. Sorry.
In 1 second, I got to click 4
Yeah.
buttons and I can only do one at a time.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
are all set, Kimberly.
Have you already connected also with Facebook?
Yes,
So
YouTube, not Facebook.
everything is ready, so we may start a few minutes informally before my welcome, because people are still connecting with the webinar. Good, I see, as usual. So welcome to everybody, and we will start just shortly in 1 minute. Okay, let's start. So welcome to everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, according to your time. As the founding director of the Enoch Seminar, it is my pleasure to introduce this online conference, which concludes a series of meetings we have promoted this year on the Within Judaism perspective. That is the reading of New Testament texts as Jewish documents within the diversity of Second Temple Judaism. The Enoch Seminar was founded 25 years ago by a group of specialists in Second Temple Judaism and Christian origins, eager to create a forum for open discussion where we could freely exchange the results of our research, regardless of any cultural or religious constraints. After organizing dozens of events and publishing over 20 edited volumes, it is still a source of constant surprise and pride for us to see how this inspired intuition has developed and consolidated over the years, engaging an ever-growing number of people and welcoming, also thanks to the online format, contributions from countries long marginalized in the international debate. For 25 years, we have faced numerous challenges. The inclusion of new methods and perspective of research, the COVID-19 pandemic, with the urgent need to develop online meetings, and now the shrinking position in humanities that make it hard for younger scholars to find a job in the field, and often even for tenured colleagues to keep their posts. In addition, the difficult international situation is pushing toward an unhealthy polarization that does not help the free circulation of ideas. We will meet these challenges as we always have, with openness and dialogue. The Enoch Seminar will remain an open and inclusive forum as its life and vision depend solely on the will of its members. The freedom and independence we have earned to address even the most controversial and innovative topics comes at a price. We are a community supported only by the commitment of volunteers and the donations of friends and members to cover the costs of our activities. We are grateful to those who have already generously contributed, even with a small donation, and to those who will do so generously during these days of the conference or at any time thereafter, as a sign of appreciation and encouragement for our work. A special thank you goes to those who contributed more directly to the organization of this event. The nearly 50 speakers, our secretary Megan Wines, the conference co-director Isaac Oliver, but above all, a heartfelt thank you goes to the hundreds of you who registered for the conference and will follow us live on Zoom or Facebook, or who will later watch the recording of the event on our YouTube channel. We expect the quality and depth of our presentations and discussions to make the event memorable and a significant scholarly contribution to the topic. With the Vice Director Kelly Bauch and Lawrence Tuchenbrook, Mrs. Gabriella Nangeroni, and all the distinguished members of the Enoch Seminar Board of Directors, I welcome all of you to our conference. Without further delay, I turn over the floor to co-director Isaac Oliver, who will introduce the topic and the goals of these 3 days of conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriele, and I want to second that welcome to everybody who is with us today on this Monday morning, afternoon, evening, night, wherever you may be across the globe, attending this Enoch seminar, Reading the New Testament Within Judaism, Part 2. Since I already shared some prolegomena on the status questionis of the topic at hand during the first part of this epic saga, which took place in the month of June, I'm not going to repeat those details here. Recordings of the first installment, by the way, are available on the Enoch Seminar YouTube channel. Instead, I want to share a few reminders of some of our goals, as well as a recap of what happened previously on Reading the New Testament Within Judaism. The title of our conference was deliberately formulated with a question mark, Reading the New Testament Within Judaism. The question mark in the title is intended to signal the open inquiry and brainstorming that we hope the conference will foster. In fact, the panelists who have received personal invitations were encouraged to respond freely to the following 3 questions. 1, should a given text from the New Testament or early Christianity be considered part of Judaism, that is, early Judaism or Second Temple Judaism? 2, what criteria determine whether an early Christian text is or is not within Judaism? And then 3, what changes when said text is read within Judaism? Some may be worried about what a priorism may lie behind these questions and therefore object with their very formulation. Please let me emphasize that the Enoch Seminar welcomes a variety of perspectives on these questions, including the questioning of the questions themselves, as we seek to make sense of a pivotal moment in the academic study of the Jewish nature of the New Testament and non-New Testament texts of early Christianity. Another distinctive feature of this conference is the ambitious range of ancient documents covered. Our aspiration is to visit as many textual sites and inquire about as many personalities of the ancient Christian landscape as possible. Not just Paul and the 7 undisputed epistles, which have enjoyed ample advertisement under the rubric Within Judaism, but also other early Christian writers and writings. Part 1 of this conference began accordingly with a session in recognition to the so-called Paul within Judaism perspective, which popularized the nomenclature within Judaism and challenged New Testament scholarship to appreciate Paul's Jewishness in a thoroughgoing manner. Perceiving that recent findings from the Paul within Judaism perspective, or even perspectives, had bearings for evaluating other early Christian texts, the chairs of the conference decided that on the question of the place of early Christianity within or vis-a-vis early Judaism, new territory needed to be explored by the Enoch Seminar. Consequently, during part one of the conference, the Enoch Seminar featured panels discussing the Gospel of Mark and the Revelation of John within Judaism for the first time in its history. Personally, I found it revealing how the panels on Paul, Mark, and Revelation simultaneously converged and diverged in their respective treatments of the three questions posed for all panelists of the conference. While many, if not most, Pauline scholars would agree with the general proposition that Paul was and continued to identify as a Jew, controversy persists over how exactly to define Paul's location within early Judaism and the meaning and parameters of the term Judaism itself. Those who coined and popularized the phrase Paul within Judaism maintain that Paul remained a Torah-observant Jew throughout his life. As Magnus Zellentin succinctly states, Paul was Jewish, thus Torah observant. Thus, for the partisans of the Paul within Judaism perspective, Paul was not just ethnically Jewish, that is, of Israelite ancestry. He would have affirmed and maintained the basic principles of what the late E.P. Sanders called common Judaism. In the eyes of the pioneers of the Paul within Judaism perspective, Paul was in many ways a common Jew rather than a radical Jew, to borrow from the title of Daniel Boyarin's book on Paul, as an important example of the new perspective on Paul, now no longer new in the wake of the newer perspectives that are emerging. In addition to maintaining that Paul remained a kosher Jew, so to speak, the pioneers of the Paul within Judaism perspective argued that Paul's message primarily concerned Gentiles. With resolving what Matthew Thiesing calls the Gentile problem, that is, accounting for how Gentiles can benefit from the covenantal package granted to Israel, given that they are not and need not, perhaps even cannot, become actual Jews. While these two major tenets of the Paul within Judaism perspective have consolidated and gained traction in recent times, some remain unconvinced by certain aspects of the argumentation put forth to support them. Some wonder to what extent Paul's message also concerned Jews in the same way that it concerned Gentiles, and contend that the diversity of Second Temple Jewish expressions could accommodate Paul's brand of Judaism, despite its apparent deviation from some of the prevailing patterns of first-century Jewish beliefs and practices. I am no prophet, but I suspect that the future of Pauline studies on the question of Paul's Jewishness will be simultaneously marked by consolidation and dissipation. On the one hand, the association of the two aforementioned tenets within the Paul within Judaism perspective has solidified. The phrase Paul within Judaism will be generally perceived as standing for Paul's enduring fidelity to Torah observance and exclusive outreach to Gentiles. At the same time, other views on Paul within Judaism are emerging. While debates will undoubtedly continue to revolve around Paul's understanding of covenant, among other things, in light of his eschatological convictions. Another sticking point that might persist and was raised during the panel on Paul was by Robert Foster, and it concerns the coherence of Paul's thought, since Paul's affirmation of Torah and Israel's election is especially pronounced in his letter to the Romans. To what extent are the views expressed in this later writing of Paul reconcilable with what is stated in his earlier letter to the Galatians? Perhaps both older and newer perspectives are correct in some ways. For the foreseeable future, we may have to content ourselves with entertaining multiple perspectives on Paul within Judaism. 70 faces to Paul, if I may. The panel on Mark within Judaism was markedly different from the Paul within Judaism panel. I perceived a certain sense of novelty and discovery during this panel, which John von Maren wonderfully spearheaded. It seems that the question on Mark's relation to or position within early Judaism is an understudy, at least when compared to the attention that the likes of Paul and Matthew have enjoyed in this area. Participants of the Mark within Judaism panel many of them newcomers to the Enoch seminar, were accordingly enthusiastic about experimenting with new ideas and critically reflecting on the circumstances that have prevented a thorough reappraisal of Mark's Jewish character. I wonder whether such readiness is partly indebted to the shifts that have been occurring in Pauline studies. Mark has often been read as a Pauline gospel of sorts. It should not come as a surprise, then, that when perceptions of Paul's relationship to Judaism change, so do evaluations in other sectors of early Christian studies. Given that Mark is widely perceived to be the earliest Christian gospel, and therefore closest in time to the Jewish inception of the Jesus movement, not to mention the equally widespread belief that Matthew, traditionally dubbed the most Jewish gospel, depends on and draws from Mark, I'm surprised then that the Jewish reappraisal of Mark has not occurred sooner. If consolidation and discovery were distinctive features of the panels on Paul and Mark, consensus, interestingly enough, reigned during the panel on Revelation within Judaism. Despite the infamous verses referring to those who claim to be Jews, but are not and belong to the synagogue of Satan, see Revelation 2:9 and 3:9, all seem to agree that there is great heuristic promise in approaching the book of Revelation as an early Jewish document. Here too, the specter of Paul loomed in the background, as many wondered, following the original thesis propounded by one of the panelists, David Frankfurter, whether the so-called Jews from the synagogue of Satan originally referred to Gentile Pauline followers of Jesus. John the Overseer rejected the Jewishness of these Paulinists, who claimed for themselves the moniker Jew, because they failed to follow basic principles of the Torah, including abstaining from porneia and eating food offered to idols. Over the next 3 days, it will be interesting to see how the conference questions and terms of the debate are variously iterated across the wide range of texts to be discussed. Hopefully, many of the requests raised by the members and friends of the Enoch seminar will be fulfilled by the end of this conference. To those wondering, what about the Gospel of Matthew? Why didn't you start with the Gospel of Matthew? I bring you good tidings. Your prayers have been answered twice. Our first panel this morning will be on Matthew. This panel coincides, by the way, with a similar event devoted to Matthew 5 years ago during the 4th Enoch Seminar Colloquium. Right after Matthew, the Enoch Seminar will host a panel on James and 1 Peter within Judaism for the first time as well. Several people behind the scenes have expressed their delight at seeing not only Paul, but also James and Peter receiving their due share of discussion under the rubric within early Judaism. Tomorrow, after a brief recap session of the findings from today's panels, we will begin with a panel on Luke and Acts within Judaism. For a long time, the Jewishness of Luke and Acts has been relegated to the background of the last frontier of Gentile Christianity. However, perceptions are changing. Almost in tandem to the Paul within Judaism perspective, a new perspective on Luke and Acts with or within early Judaism is emerging. Tomorrow's panel on Luke and Acts will critically engage with recent scholarship on this matter. For some time, requests have been sent to the Enoch Seminar to cover the letter to the Hebrews. We are pleased to announce that tomorrow the Enoch Seminar will also host a panel discussing Hebrews within the context of the diversity of Second Temple Judaism. The third and final day of the conference will commence with a panel on the Gospel of John. This will not be the first time the Enoch Seminar has devoted time and attention to the fourth Gospel of the New Testament. However, revisiting John will hopefully help us better understand how to situate its Jewish character within the broader mosaic of early Christian expressions that this conference is investigating. During previous discussions leading up to the second part of this conference, some rightly pointed out the need to broaden our investigation beyond the writings currently included in the New Testament canon. Justin Martyr was mentioned frequently, and I am pleased to announce that the final panel of the conference will include presentations on the apologists from Samaria, as well as discussions on 1 Clement, the Epistle of Barnabas, Ignatius, the Didache, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Proto-Evangelium of James, and the Gospel of Thomas. Additional panels could have been created to include even more early Christian documents for discussion. However, due to scheduling conflicts and other constraints, texts such as the Gospel of Peter, 2 Peter, the infancy of Gospel of Thomas, and so forth will have to wait for another time. I hope nonetheless that some of them will be brought up during the discussion time. Since every conference must adhere to certain limitations, Justin Martyr serves as a sort of terminus ad quem for rounding off our discussions about early Christianity within early Judaism. For some, this decision may seem arbitrary, implying that a so-called parting of the ways had decisively taken place between all Christians and Jews by the mid-2nd century. However, the decision to end with Justin Martyr is based more on pragmatic and logistical considerations than on a historical framing that teleologically assumes that the separation between Judaism and Christianity was inevitably destined to gradual occurrence and materialization by a certain point in history, be it the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, the Bar Kokhba revolt, or even the conversion of Constantine to Christianity. Even so, the deliberations of the vast assortment of Christian texts that will occur during this conference may lead some of us to wonder whether the social historical landscape and the theological terms of debate between Jews and Christians had indeed changed by the time Justin Martyr penned his dialogue with the Jew called Trifle. This Virtual Enoch seminar would not be possible without the vision of Gabriele Boccaccini, the founder and director of the Enoch Seminar. Special thanks also go to the vice directors, Kelly Koblenz-Bouch and Lauren Stuckenbrook, for their leadership and advice on this endeavor and many other activities run by the Enoch Seminar. We're also grateful for the support of the Michigan Center of Early Christian Studies, as well as for your contributions as participants and attendees of the Enoch Seminar. I will repeat the kind invitation that Gabriele mentioned. You can donate even just $5 by visiting enochseminar.org/donate. Thanks to your generous donations, the Enoch Seminar is able to continue its various endeavors at affordable or even free prices for participants and attendees. Last, but certainly not least, we would like to thank Megan Wines, PhD candidate at Loyola University, and the secretary of the Enoch Seminar for assisting with the logistical aspects of running this show. Without Megan's help, hosting this event would not be possible. Thank you, Megan. We will take now a short break for about 5-6 minutes and then resume pronto at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for the panel on Matthew, which will proceed in the order that is listed in the Enoch Seminar webpage for this conference. Thank you for joining us and see you soon. Okay, we'll be starting in a minute, and it will be, just as the schedule is indicated on the website. We do have Wayne Baxter who has just joined us. Wayne, nice to meet you, as it were. Could you just test your mic real quick, see if it's working?
Sure.
Great.
Am I working okay? Is that
Yeah,
good? Okay,
excellent.
fantastic.
And Federico is now with us as well. So happy to hear that. Buongiorno.
Hello,
Hello, good.
buongiorno, ciao.
Ciao, yes. Welcome. Great. So for this Matthew panel, because it's a long marathon for the organizers, Megan, Gabriele, and I, we might be rotating the chairing, as it were, if one of us needs to just go out for a minute or two. But we will be following the order that is listed in the schedule. As far as the presenters are concerned, presenters for the Matthew panel, and this concerns the panel that's coming up right after. You have 5 to 10 minutes to address the 3 questions that you were asked to interact with. And then we have for this Matthew panel 2 discussants who have 3 to 5 minutes to respond to what they hear during the presentations. After that, with the remaining time, it will be open to further interaction amongst the panelists, and then we can even bring in some of the attendees if they have some questions and comments as well. I want to make also one huge correction, and I feel so embarrassed about this. Megan Wines has actually completed her doctorate. She has a PhD. So congratulations to Megan Wines, Dr. Megan Wines, for that achievement. All right. So
Isaac, if I may add for the panelists, after the presentations in the discussion, we will be very happy to know what each panelist thinks about what the other panelists have said. I mean, because the entire goal of this session is exactly to have a discussion, I mean, a conversation among the participants. So it's very important that each of us also acts then as a respondent about what
yes,
the other people have said.
with the remaining time, we would try to do that. Excellent. If you're not speaking, please have your microphones off. Those who are of the second panel, the James and First Peter panel, you can stay online with your camera on. You can also turn off your camera. If you turn off your camera, you'll disappear from the screen, but we know you're here and we'll have you back. Okay, so without further ado, we will begin here, and I'm just going to the schedule myself on the Enoch webinar page here with John Kampen from Methodist Theological Union in Ohio. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I take this opportunity to be the first formally to thank Gabriella Boccaccini and Isaac Oliver for convening this remarkable conference and bringing so many of us in conversation with one another within a context that fuels worldwide consideration. Thank you for this achievement. In 1975, I graduated from a Christian seminary with a particular interest in what I would have described as at the time as the Jewish background of the New Testament. Following up on that interest, I enrolled at Hebrew Union College for doctoral studies. My first advisor was Samuel Sandmel, and I continued my work with Ben C. and Wacholder, Zichronam Livracha. You will note that these names are 2 of the 5 scholars credited by E.P. Sanders in his preface to Paul and Palestinian Judaism with reading extensive parts of an earlier draft of that landmark manuscript first published in 1977. This is my way of saying that my academic career began and continued within the academic trajectory which led to the present within Judaism perspective we are discussing today. I should hasten to add that neither one of them would have endorsed many of the positions held under this umbrella, including Sandmel on my reading of Matthew. This makes it very, very difficult for me to consider the study of Matthew except from a within Judaism perspective. In my efforts to gain a rudimentary mastery of Mishnah, Talmud, and Midrash, and some comprehension of the Greco-Jewish corpus of literature, I quickly realized the intellectual poverty of my initial quest. my focus shifted to a study of Jewish history and literature of the Second Temple period. Of greatest significance, my reading list changed from Bauer, Bultmann, Käsemann, Perrin, many luminaries of 20th century New Testament scholar, to the Jewish historians, such as Gretz, Rostovtchev, Cherikover, Klausner, Zeitlin, Neusner, then L. Baumgarten, Seth Schwartz, Danny Schwartz, Shai Cohen, Martin Goodman, Doron Mendel, Sylvia Honigman, Andrea Berlin, Paula Fredrickson, etc. So I now read Matthew within the context of the questions and perspectives offered by these historians of the Jewish experience in the early Roman imperial period. From the perspective of social history informed by sociological methods, this leads me to understand the literary composition Matthew as representative of a sectarian Jewish group from the end of the 1st century CE. Reading Matthew within Judaism means treating it as an artifact of Jewish history. It is my work on the scrolls from Qumran, another corpus of artifacts of Second Temple Jewish history, which permitted me to be more specific in my study of Matthew. It was as I developed a deeper appreciation of the halachic issues of the era, informed by relevant texts from Qumran, that I began to recognize the socio-religious location of Matthew within Judaism. Such an approach has certain consequences. For the reading of Matthew, this means studying it in the context of the other Jewish literature of the era prior to an examination of its place in relationship to other writings from the early movement of Jesus' followers. This fundamental starting point should set those working from the within Judaism perspective apart from other scholars of these texts. This means that the interpretation of Matthew 5:17 does not begin as a contrast to the traditional understanding of Paul or Mark as advocating the obsolescence of the law for the followers of Jesus. In my study, this means placing Matthew 5 within the context of the halachic disputes between and among Jewish groups and parties of the last 2 centuries of the Second Temple era. That is, reading these disputes within the development of Jewish law during that era. While it is not necessary to discount the use of Mark and even something like Q as sources for the author, it does permit, and in the case of Matthew, I would argue necessitate, a different Jewish context for the first gospel than that of the other narrative biographies based upon the life of Jesus. For example, it then fits within the context of texts normally listed under the heading of Palestinian Judaism, as opposed to those related to various areas of the diaspora. But the works of the New Testament and some other compositions do represent the literature of the origins of a movement of great historical significance. How many works of the New Testament and other compositions attributed to the Jesus movement of the 1st century fall within Judaism continues to be a matter of debate, and I'm certain we'll hear more about that in the next few days. I would suggest that many should be read within this perspective, but they fit within a variety of Jewish contexts and Jewish literary trajectories. In the case of Matthew, it is as a sectarian Jewish composition that the historian evaluates its utility for the examination of issues attendant the exploration of Christian origins. This results in a much more complex portrait of the groups who claim affiliation with the Jesus movement. Every composition deserves a similar analysis, recognizing that many of the sources informing our understanding of that movement need to be understood first and foremost as examples of the literary production of Jews in the early Roman imperial period. This approach to the reading of Matthew has important results worth noting that simultaneously are challenges. First, the within Judaism approach challenges the canonical hegemony that pervades its study. The first analytical task of the reader historian is to read the work in the context of the Jewish history of the period and its attendant questions, already discussed above. In the history of the study of the first gospel, this is a significantly different starting point. The second result challenge is to loosen the hold on the study of Matthew of the Christian theological concerns which have made the work so important in the history of the church and the questions for which it has been seen as a source of authoritative answers. These issues have made it the most important composition for a good deal of the Christian church's history. The vast majority of scholarship on the first gospel has been motivated by attempts to address those concerns, including scholarship up to the present day. Compare the amount of academic literature devoted to the study of messianism in the first gospel versus the extent to which the halakhic issues of Second Temple Jewish life have received attention. Messianism is relevant for this study, but not the only guiding question. The anachronisms associated with our field of study, including the most obvious terms, Judaism and Christianity, continue to plague the historical lenses we bring to our study of the first gospel. Adele Reinhartz, in a recent article in the volume Negotiating Identities, has interrogated a number of other terms, such as the mother-daughter metaphor or that of sibling rivalry. All of these have been very much at play in the study of Matthew, that most Jewish book. The last decade or two in Qumran studies have been particularly focused on defining and redefining genres of the literature it contains, questioning the sociological categories applied to any historical reconstructions related to the texts, and attempting to classify other phenomena identified in its literature. We need a similar approach to the within Judaism perspective. The utilization of the within Judaism perspective for the study of New Testament texts, including Matthew, points out the inadequacies in the classifications presently employed to aid us in our study and our understanding of this pivotal text, and suggests we begin a similar reevaluation of the terms we use for classification in our studies.
Thank you, Professor John Kampen, for that wonderful opening to this panel on Matthew. We are going to proceed immediately to the next presenter, Andrew Bowden, who's joining us from Germany, I believe.
Yes. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. I also want to begin by thanking Gabriele Boccaccini and Isaac Oliver for convening this conference about the important question of whether or not the New Testament should be read within Judaism. And I also want to thank all of those who are attending today. My current research about food motifs in Matthew has led me to important conclusions about whether or not Matthew should be read as a Jewish text, which I will share today in relation to the question of whether or not this gospel instructs its readers or its community to fast. In this presentation, I will examine these instructions about fasting in Matthew and how they compare to Jewish and Greco-Roman understandings of this topic. My presentation today will be structured as follows. First, I will briefly consider who fasted in the 1st century CE and the reasons for this. Secondly, I will observe that as in other texts, other early Jewish texts, fasting remained essential in Matthew as a marker of group identity. However, in contrast to these Jewish texts, Matthew 6:16-18 draws a distinction between the manner that the Matthean followers of Jesus should fast from other Jewish groups of this time, namely, alone and in secret. In this manner, I suggest that Matthew provides its readers a manner to distinguish themselves from other early Jews to distinguish themselves. Next, after briefly considering a few other passages in Matthew that talk about fasting, I will draw conclusions. So we begin by questioning who fasted in the first century CE and why. Scholarship has demonstrated that public meals were a primary opportunity in the Roman Empire to establish and confirm social identity. Dennis Smith, for example, explains that the people of the Mediterranean world from around 300 BCE through 300 CE shared the same general meal customs, regardless of their status in society, their class, their religion, the region from which they came, or their identification as Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, or Jews, including the Jewish Passover meal, or as well Christianity. However, the decision of Jewish groups in the Roman Empire to fast was a primary distinction in their meal practices from other groups around them. Jews fasted for several different reasons. One, for example, is that they were commanded to do so in the Torah. For example, on Yom Kippur, the day of national Jewish repentance. The Hebrew Bible also clarifies that in times of emergency, all of Israel would fast, hoping that God would avert this calamity. Prayer, as well as confession of sins, often accompanied Jewish fasting, which was also often accompanied by outward signs of fasting, such as wearing sackcloth or putting ashes on one's face or carrying the... Well, the Jewish readiness to fast contra Roman Empire, who instead emphasized the importance of exercising self-control at meals, but not from abstaining from meals. Therefore, because fasting in the Roman Empire was primarily associated with Judaism, fasting became a key marker of this group during this time period. So there are many examples of this, but I will just name Tacitus, who describes the markers of Judaism consisting, among other things, of abstaining from eating pork, observing the Sabbath, observing circumcision, and as well, frequent fasting. In light of these observations, it is significant that Matthew makes use of this Jewish identification marker of fasting and emphasizes this practice for its own audience. Nevertheless, I suggest that this gospel draws an important distinction in Matthew 6 about how this community should fast, alone and in secret, to distinguish themselves from other early Jewish groups during this time. So because of this detail, we'll now take a closer look at Matthew 6, 16, 18. The instructions here in this passage, Matthew 6, clarify that the hypocrites mentioned in Matthew 6, 16 refer to the author's depiction of Jews as outsiders who regularly publicly fasted, and others they were fasting by disfiguring of faces. This was the sign that they were fasting. For the Matthean Jesus, fasting remained essential, which he talks about in this passage. However, to draw a line of distinction between the fasting of the followers of Jesus from Jews, Matthew 6, 17 through 18 explains that when the followers of Jesus fast, they should do so individually and in a secret between themselves as individuals and God. In this way, the Matthean Jesus gives his followers a way to distinguish themselves from other Jewish groups during this time, to basically say, we still fast, but we fast differently from those Jews around us, mainly individually and in secret. So unfortunately, because of time constraints, I'm going to need to skip over all other passages related to fasting in Matthew and just name two additional passages briefly, namely in Matthew 9:14 and Matthew 11:18. So Matthew 9:10 talks about Jesus is asked at a meal in a home with his disciples why he doesn't fast, why he and his disciples don't fast, and instead eat with tax collectors and sinners. The author suggests that this group of unwanted people eating with Jesus drew attention to itself, causing the disciples of John, together with the Jewish authorities, Jesus the Father, namely, why do we and the Pharisees fast so frequently, but your disciples do not fast? Interpreting this passage in Matthew 9, in light of what was previously said about fasting in Matthew 6, indicates possibly that the followers of Jesus were already implementing his instruction about private, secret fasting alone as individuals. And instead, in the public, they had the reputation for eating, for attending meals, and for doing so with sinners and tax collectors. And then shortly after this passage in Matthew 11:18, while John the Baptist is criticized here for going without food and water, Jesus is condemned for eating and drinking with sinners and tax collectors. So we see this mention of sinners and tax collectors again with the meal. This clarifies again that the crowds in Matthew were able to distinguish between the apparent lack of fasting by Jesus and his followers, in contrast to the Baptist and his disciples in Matthew 11:18. The Baptist accordingly had a reputation for living an ascetic lifestyle, while Jesus and his followers were known supposedly for being gluttons and drunkards. This point again indicates that the Matthean author distinguished between the fasting practices of Jesus and his followers and other Jews of this time. Although in this passage, Jesus is portrayed as accepting the Baptist and his disciples' practice of fasting, he and his followers fast differently. Thus, these two passages kind of confirm what I was saying about fasting, that fasting is still important in Matthew, but done differently. So I now come to conclusions to this brief presentation. This brief presentation has observed that fasting was something distinct to early Judaism and served as a key marker for Judaism during the Roman Empire. Matthew continues using this important Jewish marker in connection with Jesus and his followers, which adds further support to the view that Matthew should be read as a Jewish text. However, to draw a distinction between the manner of fasting for the Matthean community from other Jewish groups, this gospel explains unique fasting practices in this gospel. Whereas other Jews fasted publicly for various reasons, Matthew 6 teaches that the followers of Jesus should fast individually, alone, and in secret, thereby giving them a way to distinguish themselves from other Jewish groups around them. Thus, Matthew affirms a basic marker of Jewish identity in referring to fasting. Nevertheless, by offering these unique instructions about fasting, it distinguishes the inside group of true followers of Jesus, who basically consisted of the Matthean community, from those other groups outside who fasted but did so differently. And it identifies this Jewish marker of fasting alongside, for example, in Matthew and many other Second Temple Jewish texts, almsgiving and prayer, Torah observance, Sabbath observance, and temple offerings. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Andrew Bowden, for that presentation. We're going to proceed to the next presenter, Celia Deutsch. You may now begin. Thank you.
Hello. I too would like to join those who've gone before me in thanking Gabriele and Isaac Oliver for inviting me, first of all, for organizing this conference, but for inviting me to join this panel. I'm really grateful for the meticulous care that Isaac has paid to all of the details. And I'm also grateful for all the instructions, Isaac. I'd like to say something about my own personal pursuit, of these questions. I came through a journey that wasn't as personal and familial as much as it is intellectual. Growing up in a household that was Jewish through my father and Catholic through my mother, I was profoundly aware of the anti-Semitism that surrounded us. I was also aware that the interpretations of the gospel preached on Sunday, including Matthew, had something to do with that. I knew that these interpretations were misleading at best and often deeply hurtful and downright wrong. And through personal reading throughout high school, I learned the history of anti-Semitism that led to the Shoah. I joined a religious order, the Sisters of Our Lady of Zion, which is a Catholic community that has an institutional commitment to understanding between people of different religious traditions, particularly Jews and Christians. University years and other studies, first of all, at St. Michael's, the University of Toronto, the Union Theological Seminary and Jewish Theological Seminary, brought me to the academic study of religious texts, including Jewish sources. My confessional statement makes it obvious that my study of Matthew is embedded in and influenced by personal bias, and I just underlined that word bias, on many levels. But the study of Second Temple literature and history, rabbinic sources, all in the context of the Greco-Roman world, has left me unable to imagine studying Matthew as anything other than a Jewish text, a sectarian text produced in and for a group that views itself as marginalized, persecuted, and privileged. Now, first of all, I'd like to say something about Matthew, the author or redactor. And this is, I'm keeping in mind the three questions we were asked to consider. I want to begin by saying that outright, as I've said just now, that the Gospel of Matthew was written by a Jew or Jewish or Judean, if you want, follower of Jesus. I believe that he wrote it with an audience in mind of other Jewish followers of Jesus. However, an audience that included a significant number of Gentiles and that had a Gentile mission. My main criterion for saying this is what Matthew does not say. Matthew, of course, says nothing directly in answer to the question, Matthew, are you Jewish? It is clear that he is in bitter conflict with opposing teachers, who are most often called Pharisees, but occasionally scribes or Sadducees. He's also in conflict with priests. But he's also bitterly aggrieved by what he perceives to be the Jewish rejection of Jesus as Messiah. But nowhere does he say or indicate that he is not Jewish, that he has left the people Israel. Matthew writes from a deep and wide acquaintance with biblical and later Jewish sources. As it has been widely demonstrated, he knows Jewish interpretive methods and is steeped in the patterns of thought evident in sources like First Enoch, Second Baruch, Fourth Ezra, and I realize that these are post Second Temple, but in his general time frame, as well as the Dead Sea Scrolls. He is most adequately understood, I think, against, obviously, the background of these sources. Like other sectarian Jews, he perceives his to be the correct understanding of the tradition. He perceives himself also to be the proper instructor of his community. For Matthew, the scribe who has become a disciple in the kingdom of heaven, all understandings and all other teachers are simply wrong. Secondly, the community. Well, as we all know, it is notoriously difficult to assign a geographical location or even a social setting for Matthew's community, or to know what the community was like. The Gospel of Matthew reflects the work of a learned person, was an audience of learned people, including perhaps learned women. They were probably wealthy, given the economics of learning in the ancient world. Is that who they were? Was it another kind of voluntary association, as some propose? And what about the women and the children? Were they included? Were some of did this association, if it was an association, draw people from various quarters of the city in which it was located? Well, we don't know. What we know is what is in the text itself. That is, we can say certain things about what the author thought, the redactor thought, about the identity of his audience, their challenges, issues, and the like. What we can tell is that Matthew assumed that they would have understood that the genealogy would represent the stories behind the names and events like the deportation. Matthew spends a great deal of time instructing his audience about such matters as a proper interpretation of Shabbat observance, ritual purity, food laws, and the like. But nowhere does he describe Jesus as telling his disciples not to observe Shabbat, ritual cleanliness, or food laws. He says nothing about circumcision, perhaps because he simply, my guess and my speculation is that he assumes it, and he says nothing about it because it isn't a question. That was also, all of this was the case in other Jewish sects. On these points, the Gospel of Matthew suggests a gospel that does Jewish, that lives Jewishly. Matthew makes derogatory reference to the Gentiles in a couple of places. He says, in praying, do not keep up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think they will be heard because of their many words. That's not very pro-Gentile. Do not worry about the necessities of life, Jesus exhorts, because it is the Gentiles who seek these things. But for the most part, his Gentiles are portrayed in positive fashion, including the 4 women in the genealogy. All Gentiles are assumed to be Gentiles. Jesus's family history included Gentiles thus, though their status as proselytes, according to the later tradition, would have meant that they were actually Jews, part of the people Israel. There is the centurion whose faith Jesus praises, the Canaanite woman who challenges Jesus to heal her daughter, Pilate's wife, the centurion who acknowledges Jesus as Son of God. And then there is the closing command with Jesus commissioning the disciples to make disciples of all the nations. I think Matthew believed that the disciples were to call all nations to follow Jesus as members of the people Israel. And I do not think as well that he abrogated in any way the command to go to the people Israel. In other words, I think he assumed circumcision for male converts and full observance of Jewish tradition for all those being baptized, very much in the pattern of Jewish proselytes. His group has its own rituals: baptism, Eucharist, or what we would later call Eucharist, the prayer in chapter 6. This is typical of sectarian practice, but it observes the boundary practices that define what it means to be a Jew: circumcision, Shabbat, purity laws, food laws, tithing, etc., according to the group's interpretation of Torah as it understands Jesus's teaching. I think Matthew considers his community to be Jewish, made up largely of people born into the people Israel, and including converts who have become a part of that people. There may be tensions between the two groups. Some sources of this period and slightly later indicate the ambiguous status of the convert, but Matthew is attempting to show them that they are indeed members of one people, and he sets out to teach them how to live that reality. We do not know what happened to his community. Did they remain predominantly born Jews, or did the Gentile converts come to predominate, as was the case in other communities? We don't know. We do know that the first evidence of reception, either of Matthew or Matthean material, is in the letters of Ignatius of Antioch, a decade or so later after Matthew is written. What changes if I think Matthew and his audience are not Jewish? What happens if I posit that the Gospel of Matthew is not written within Judaism? It's problematic, and I have to say, within Judaism, for me, it's a problematic phrase. In the first place, apart from the canonical status, the Gospel of Matthew is a historical document. If Matthew is not a Jewish document within Judaism, then we lose a source of understanding Jewish history and culture and religion in the first century. If we, however, let the evidence speak for itself and posit that the Gospel of Matthew was indeed written within Judaism, there are consequences for our understanding of both emerging Judaism and emerging Christianity. We need to reckon with the boundaries that are fluid in this period and with the whole of this, creating a context that is much more complex than we are often comfortable with, but much richer than perhaps we had thought. I would also add that what I would regard as a mistaken understanding of Matthew also opens the gates again for the kind of anti-Semitism that we know has been fed by such an improper understanding. The evidence, I think, forces us, however, to deal with Matthew's understanding of Jesus. His Jesus is not only Messiah, which would not be problematic, particularly in his time, and Son of God, which can also be dealt with. But Matthew's Jesus is divine wisdom, and he is conflated with the angelic Son of Man, who assumes the functions of judge in the eschaton. All of this can only be understood, first of all, within the world of Jewish sources, none of which, however, to my knowledge, identifies wisdom and the Son of Man with a specific human being. Interestingly, which makes this also even more complicated, the points of conflict between Matthew's Jesus and Jewish leaders are largely about interpretation of tradition, not what we would call Christology. But I wonder, were Matthew's audience a generation later still considering themselves as being within the Jewish people? Did their Jewish neighbors still consider them Jewish, even if they attended another synagogue? That's all. I just leave you with these questions. They're my questions.
Thank you, Celia Deutsch, for that wonderful presentation. We will proceed next with Daniel Gurtner, a veteran, if I may put it that way, in a good sense, of the Enoch seminar. You may present. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, that was so brilliant, Celia. I feel like I don't really have anything to say. I just wanted to jot down some notes on what she said. I too am grateful for the opportunity to address the important question of the New Testament within Judaism in general and the Gospel of Matthew within Judaism in particular. One thing that has become increasingly clear to me since Anders Runeson and I co-edited the Matthew Within Judaism volume in 2020 is that while scholars at that time and since may readily embrace the within Judaism perspective, Matthew is, of course, the quote unquote Jewish gospel. Precisely what is meant by that differs widely. So addressing these pertinent questions affords us the opportunity to bring these conversations out into the open for collegial discussion. And so I thank Gabriele Boccaccini for the opportunity to participate, for his characteristic innovation and relentless efforts for friendly exchange of ideas in this forum of the Enoch Seminar, and to Isaac Oliver for not only the tireless organizational tasks associated with this event, but as Celia mentioned, the very clear communication and especially lending his own considerable expertise to the conversation, as was evident in the introduction to this conversation today. So we were asked to consider why Matthew should or should not be within Judaism, what criteria we would espouse in using such a determination, and what difference it makes when Matthew is read within Judaism. And I, as a Matthean specialist in theory who dabbles within Judaism, would like to address these pertinent questions by reformulating them into something which I hope gets to the heart of both while also addressing fellow Matthean people. And that is to ask, how does one determine whether Matthew belongs within Judaism in the first place? How do we recognize it when we see it? And conversely, when we don't? Who determines what Judaism is in the first century CE, and who is in and who is out? And I think, to John Kampen's point earlier, the Qumran sectarians address this matter quite directly, though obviously not in the same way. So the social context, at least broadly speaking, is not so straightforward as it may seem. At the same time, as Matthias Conrad has shown with representative examples in his recent survey of the topic of Matthew within Judaism, and I'm referring to the volume edited by Karen Hedner-Zetterholm and Anders Runeson, an excellent volume. On the topic of Matthew within Judaism, the evangelist's Jewish voice and his social world, insofar as it can be mirrored in the way he narrates the story of Jesus, is Jewish in character. A second factor, according to Conrad, is that is often a sticking point for the within Judaism perspective, is Matthew's relationship to Gentiles. And here too, the Qumran material, to a degree, can be instructive, at least heuristically. But for Matthean scholarship, I'd like to probe our questions further still. Further than the why not questions, the what criteria questions, and even the so what questions. Not because they're unimportant, but I think in Matthean scholarship, we can sometimes address this very question utilizing methodological conventions, and I think Conrad's survey supports this, that they are neither questioned nor explained. Much of our scholarly discourse about Matthew within Judaism is framed in terms of the so-called Matthean community. The unquestioned maxim is that somehow and in some form, the gospel can be read in a manner that reflects the Zitzim Leben of that community, and we can determine this community's relation to the author's community as reconstructed in some undefined way within the text with respect to Judaism, a Judaism that is likewise reconstructed in some undefined way from the text also. It is such an unquestioned assumption in Matthean scholarship that is in his excellent 2004 monograph, Paul Foster can merely state as one of the assumptions of his entire work is that there were communities as intended readers, which he neither defines nor defends. Foster is typical of peer-reviewed Matthean scholarship on this point, and my objective is not to critique Foster on his scholarship, but rather to recognize that we are operating under methodological presuppositions that may very well be valid, but no longer require any explanation or articulation of any kind. The concern here is not with the community hypothesis per se. Some of you may know I am a student of Richard Bauckham. But that the hypothesis itself has somehow gone unquestioned in standard peer review scholarship, and as an unstated and unquestioned set of assumptions about method, whether we are influenced by a reading strategy first espoused by G.D. Kilpatrick in 1946 or Rudolf Bultmann further back in 1921, both were derived in a context where the Dead Sea Scrolls had not yet been discovered, let alone utilized. My point is simply this. Even to evaluate whether Matthew belongs within Judaism or not, we cannot establish a certain criteria, a litmus test to say whether it's in or out. Rather, we need to reassess the tools at our disposal, at least to some degree, or at least evaluate what tools we are using, rather than simply using the same tools and assuming they are valid without at least asking the question. So that's the issue that I have to raise with my Matthean colleagues. So what does Matthean within Judaism mean? How do we tell if Matthew is within Judaism? First, I think to be able to answer the question adequately requires us to sharpen our tools. And by that, I simply mean to revisit the validity of the tools to at least ask the question. Perhaps they are just as valid, but at least to re-examine the presuppositions so that we can, I've noticed this in going to peer-reviewed journals where so often we expect terms to be explained or methods to be justified. That no longer is the case with things like Matthew's community and reading strategies for determining Matthew within Judaism. Second, I think we need to recognize that the paucity of external sources with respect to Judaism that our Matthean forebears operated under is no longer the case. We have a host of primary source material from the Second Temple period that at our disposal that is of tremendous heuristic value, that, if nothing else, provides comparative material for Matthew by which we can hold Matthew up and make comparative observations to at least again of heuristic value to to address some of these questions. Third, and this I think must be our starting point, and that is, and I think this has been addressed already, that is to ask how one determines whether or not Matthew belongs within Judaism or not must be a privilege granted to the intention of the author. And here I turn to John Nolan's commentary on Matthew. In his discussion of genre, he asks simply, what kind of document did Matthew think he was writing? And I think this is heuristically instructive question for our discussion today. What is Matthew's self-understanding with respect to Judaism? Where should we look to find his expression of it? The second question, I think, is not difficult to answer, and I think we have we can find it pretty clearly, and that is his inferences about his citations of the Hebrew Bible. Positively, I think identifying Matthew within Judaism should consider evidence of Matthew's self-identification. And here, I think we find the best help, not in terms of contemporary conflicts or comparisons, nor in hypothetical reconstructions of community. And I'm not saying those are irrelevant. I'm just saying instead, I think clear textual indications of Matthew's self-understanding in the narrative he recounts is much stronger evidence. The natural tethering point to this is to the sacred text of Israel, to which he appeals so often. This notion is suggested by Zetterholm and Runeson in the introduction to their Within Judaism volume that I mentioned earlier. There they note, among other items, self-identification of a writing as one of the means by which an early Christian text is located. In this respect, it seems clear and obvious that Matthew understands himself to be fully in accord with the scriptures of Israel. While it is surely true, as Conrad remarks, that the numerous references to the scriptures of Israel are a clear indicator for the location of Matthew within Judaism, I think we can say more. I think we can claim that it is a reflection of Matthew's self-identification as Jewish, in full accord with the sacred writings of Israel, that we can locate the Gospel of Matthew.
Thank you, Daniel Gurtner, for raising some very important questions. That's what we'd like to do here, is really brainstorm together about these questions on the questions. We're going to proceed to our next participant, Susan Rieske. Have I pronounced your last name correctly? I apologize. Please correct me if I mispronounced it. And your mic needs to be unmuted.
Sorry, it's Rieske is how it's pronounced,
Rieske.
actually.
There you go.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I too want to thank Gabriele Boccaccini and Isaac Oliver for this invitation to present at this conference. I do consider it a privilege to be a part of this dialogue. Few questions are more contested in Matthean studies than whether the Gospel of Matthew should be read within Judaism or is moving beyond it, and there does not look to be a conclusive answer anytime soon. Here, I would like to offer a modest contribution by presenting two insights from my own work focused on this generation in Matthew that may move the needle a bit on this argument, illuminating Matthew's position within or on the edge of first-century Judaism. This phrase is central to my forthcoming monograph, This Generation and the Elect in the Book of Matthew, A Tale of Two Families. As I argue there, this generation is a group represented primarily by the Jewish leaders, but including some within the populace who join in their persecutory schemes. Importantly, it does not represent Israel in its entirety, nor does it speak judgment on all those within Judaism, the writer's own people. I'll leave the full details to be explained there, But today I will zero in on two key themes within this generation motif and use these to illustrate the significance of certain criteria in this discussion. As I argue, the tensions we see in the gospel reflect the lived experience of its audience, who seem to occupy a liminal space between intramuros and extramuros, still rooted in Palestinian Judaism, yet increasingly marginalized as they face persecution from this generation. As we know, one primary criterion we use for determining the answer to this question is historical setting. Of course, our determination of this must come from the text of Matthew itself, and thus must be held with hermeneutical humility. The first and perhaps most important insight from my work is that Matthew's audience was enduring real, violent, and even lethal persecution at the hands of this generation. Again, a group represented primarily by the Jewish leaders and some individuals who joined them, who persecuted Jesus himself. This generation, as I refer to it, is prominent in the gospel, explicitly highlighted in 6 key passages, forming a distinct motif. That their persecution continued into Matthew's day is evident in repeated assurances that Jesus' followers will suffer persecution, in Matthew's framing of this persecution as a continuation of the martyrdom of Israel's prophets, in his emphasis on divine vindication, and in the promise of eschatological judgment upon this generation for the shedding of righteous blood. In fact, it is difficult to imagine that Matthew 23:34 does not include Matthew's audience. As Jesus warns, "I am sending you prophets, sages, and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some you will flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town, so that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth." For Matthew, then, the persecution of his audience places their suffering squarely within the long-standing pattern of prophetic persecution that was itself concrete, violent, and historically attested. Moreover, Matthew is offering his audience a theological rationale for their persecution by this generation by drawing on the familiar Jewish motif of the conflict between the righteous and the wicked, traced through the Hebrew Bible and Second Temple literature. Here we see a focus on the criteria of rootedness in the Jewish scriptures. In Matthew 23, this generation is situated in the spiritual lineage that persecuted God's prophets throughout history, a lineage portrayed in starkly polemical and even cosmic terms, with satanic associations such as the epithet offspring of vipers and the link to Beelzebul in Matthew 12. Matthew's point is clear. His audience should expect persecution from this generation because they are part of a larger redemptive historical struggle. This idea is not unique to Matthew. It echoes in Jewish apocalyptic writings, such as the Apocalypse of Weeks and Jubilees 23, where a wicked generation opposes the righteous. In fact, Matthew's generation motif is solidly anchored in Second Temple Jewish ideology. For Matthew, however, the righteous are Jesus' followers, including his own audience, whose persecution from within Judaism highlights their liminal position, still rooted in their tradition, yet not safe within it, increasingly pushed to the margins for their loyalty to Jesus. A second insight from my work affirming their liminal status is the nature of Matthew's gospel as a family story, with the genealogy as a charter for this family. This touches on the criteria of identity formation, self-understanding, and scriptural continuity. As I have argued, the gospel is framed as a story of conflict between two spiritual families, the Messianic family and this generation. As part of establishing this conflict, Matthew begins his gospel with an incipit, Biblos Genesios Jesu Christou, that echoes the Toledot formula of Genesis that introduced family narratives about the line leading to Israel and linking Jesus' lineage to this line. As such, the gospel is introduced as the story of the Toledot of Jesus Christ, essentially a story about the family of Jesus the Messiah. At the same time, this shows that the writer of Matthew envisions his gospel as a guide for leading the believing community from its deep Jewish roots toward a new identity as a distinct family of God. In turn, then, within this family story, the genealogy functions as a charter for the Messianic family, delineating its boundaries for the future. Not only does it hint at Gentile inclusion, but as I argue in my study, Matthew's omissions, including that of a generation, suggests that those engaged in persecuting God's people are omitted from this family. Thus, Matthew serves as a foundational guide directing his audience's transition from full participation within Jewish institutions to a distinct, defined community, one marked by loyalty to Jesus and real ongoing persecution. Viewing Matthew's audience as liminal changes how we read the gospel. They face very real persecution that is both internal and external, while their identity remains dual, rooted in Judaism, yet forming a distinct community, with the gospel itself guiding them through this in-between space. Unlike intramuros or extramuros perspectives, this view highlights the tension and transition woven throughout the narrative. Furthermore, it also makes broader circulation possible, rather than an audience limited to one particular community. While likely birthed within Palestinian Judaism, it seems designed to be circulated to Jewish Christian communities across the Roman Empire, reflected in its literary form, Greek language, curious references to their synagogues, and the focus on universal mission. Ultimately, Matthew's audience is caught between worlds, the world of their Jewish roots, practices, and communal life, and the emerging world of a distinct Jesus-centered community marked by loyalty to the Messiah and persecution from this generation. In this liminal position, Matthew's gospel speaks simultaneously to those within the bounds of early Judaism and to those beyond it, while offering a blueprint for a community faithful to its roots, yet moving toward a new identity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have one more presentation before we turn to the discussants. Our last presenter is Wayne Baxter.
Thank you for that. And I'd like to stand on the shoulders of the previous panelists in thanking Gabriele and Isaac for putting this together. And thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this. And also thank you, Megan, for all the administrative groundwork that goes into putting this together. And congratulations on your newly minted PhD. So I'm structuring my, I guess I'd call it a paperette in terms of the when, the why, and the so what. When I started reading Matthew within Judaism, why I started reading it within Judaism, and what difference it can make to our understanding of Matthew's gospel. So in terms of the when, I come from a church background, and for most people in the church, since Paul wrote most of the New Testament in terms of the different number of books that comprise it, many of us in the church tend to read the New Testament through the lens of Paul, right? We Paulify the New Testament. And most people in most churches believe that the Apostle Paul makes his hard, fast social, theological distinction and separation between Judaism and Christianity. Essentially, you're either a Christian or a Jew, and never the twain shall meet. Well, in the early aughts, I did my PhD at McMaster University, where professors like my supervisor, Anders Runeson, and profs like Annette Reed, they started to challenge my thinking on this matter. And I started to see that the early Jesus movement and early Judaism didn't have finely delineated boundary lines drawn around them, and that these religions were socially, or they could be socially and religiously somewhat messier than I'd previously imagined or heard. So the why. Why did I start reading Matthew within Judaism? My dissertation explored the shepherd motif in the Gospel of Matthew as an entry point into the partings of the ways debate between the early Jesus movement and early Judaism. So why study a metaphor for a socio-religious question? Well, linguists have long realized that the gap between words and the reference they attempt to describe, metaphors help bridge this word-referent divide. Scholars like Christopher Tilley and Jonathan Culler contend that a metaphor is a matter of thought. In other words, metaphors govern reasoning and constitute understanding. They're fundamental to how we think. Given the primary nature of metaphors in human thought, scholars have increasingly made the connection between metaphor and culture, recognizing that metaphors carry culture-bound assumptions about everyday life. Gary Anderson, for example, takes up this metaphor-culture connection, arguing not only that metaphors possess intrinsic meaning in their own right, but that means that the ultimate significance of the metaphor comes from the context of the metaphor user. And as such, its meaning would be tied to the social historical context of the user. Thus, given the primary nature of metaphor with respect to thought and communication, And given the close connection between metaphor and culture, the appropriations of metaphor would reflect something of the user's thoughts or patterns of thought according to the way in which the writer shapes or deploys the metaphor. So this brings us to the notion of patterns of thought, or what E.P. Sanders called patterns of religion. And Sanders believed that it's not what adherents do, i.e. their religious practices, but how they understand what they do, what these practices accomplish for them in their religion. So a pattern of religion is comprised of patterns of ritual, behavior, and patterns of thought or belief, that the latter consisting of separate motifs, like in the case of Matthew, his shepherd motif. By way of backdrop to my study of Matthew, I began looking at the shepherd metaphor in the Hebrew Bible and in the writings of Second Temple Jewish authors and in non-Christ believing first century Greco-Roman authors, as well as in the texts of other Christ believers. And the shepherd metaphor serves as a common leadership symbol for Second Temple Jews, like it's used for God and for kings and commanders, and for Christ believers as well. They'll appropriate it for Jesus and for assembly leaders. So as such, the metaphor represents a central thought pattern for these sets of authors. While not exactly a leadership symbol for non-Christ believing first century Greco-Roman writers, the use, or rather the disuse, of pastor, the Latin term for shepherd, is quite telling and says something about that group's beliefs concerning shepherds and shepherding. While analyzing these sets of texts, I observed distinctive patterns of usage and thought reflected in the appropriation of the shepherd metaphor by each of these different groups of authors. And so the question was, with which group does Matthew's own appropriation of the shepherd metaphor resemble? In other words, does this motif reflect someone who thinks like a non-Christ believing Jew, or a non-Christ believing Greco-Roman, or some configuration of Christ belief? My study revealed that Matthew thinks like a Jew. That is, his motif most closely resembles the patterns of thought reflected by the shepherd metaphor's usage in the Hebrew Bible and in Second Temple Jewish writings more than it does the texts of Christ believers or non-Christ believing Greco-Romans. Hence, Matthew can and should be read within Judaism. So what? Well, even a casual reader of Matthew's gospel can recognize its strongly Jewish overtones, like its frequent use of the Jewish scriptures, its Jewish themes, like the Son of David motif, its exposition of Torah and Jewish customs, etc. But to say that Matthew thinks like a Jew suggests more than just the presence of Jewish themes. Three of the implications of reading Matthew's within Judaism, at least as far as the evangelist shepherd motif is concerned, would be the following. One, with respect to the notion of replacement, while many Christians assume that the church has replaced Israel, reading Matthew within Judaism means that no replacement has occurred. For Matthew, it's not the Jews who've been replaced as God's people, but Israel's leaders as the shepherds of Israel. Two, with respect to leadership, Matthew avoids using the term shepherd for assembly leaders because for him, the term possesses strong political overtones, as it does for non-Christ believing Jews, making it inappropriate for assembly leaders. The Mattheans would likely have referred to their leaders as prophets, scribes, disciples, servants, sages, righteous men, teachers, all terms that appear in Matthew's gospel, as opposed to using some of the titles in texts of other Christ-believing authors, terms like overseer, evangelist, elder, and shepherd. With respect to the gospel mission, i.e. the question of who the Mattheans communities were trying to reach with their message of the kingdom, Matthew, in my judgment, had an inclusively Jewish approach to the mission, whereby Mattheans concentrated on gaining non-Christ believing Jewish followers, but not to the exclusion of Gentiles. Matthew's Jewish focus meant that Gentiles would have been comprised, they would have comprised only a minority within the Matthean communities. And it's also meant that Gentile members would have expected to keep the Torah as interpreted by Jesus and his Matthean successors in the same way that Jewish members did in the fold. So Gentile obedience to Jesus' Torah would have facilitated table fellowship between Jews and Gentiles in the Matthean communities, which had clearly become an issue in some of the other Christ-believing assemblies. Just see Romans 14 and Galatians 2. So that's my paperette. Thank you again for inviting me to be a part of this.
Thank you, Wayne. We now have two discussants who have been assigned with the task of briefly responding to what has been said. John von Marin, who I already said was part of the first segment of this conference and led the Mark Within Judaism panel, and then Federico Adenolfi. We have the opportunity each to speak for 3 to 5 minutes. John, go ahead.
Thank you, Isaac, and thank you, Gabriella. I'll keep the intro or the thanks short because I have 3 to 5 minutes. I've been tasked with a response and also saying something about Mark and Matthew because I'm really coming from Mark and Matthew is not quite my home, but I keep ending up in Matthew, for example, today. One theme that I see in, I think, almost all of these presentations, which have been very interesting and really informative, is the idea of groupness or sect or community or the social aspect of this. And I think we can make some progress on these questions. I completely agree with Daniel that the focus on community, which we don't have, is a little bit risky, but I think there are some ways forward. And here I'm thinking of, there's a lot of work in social sciences on groups and their boundaries and how they work. And I also like the idea of focusing on the texts because we have texts, and in texts to focus on self-identification and to get at this in a variety of ways, especially the way the writer categorizes people and where they place themselves and where they place their audience within these groups. So to me, this is a way to focus on the categories without actually going to the social question and to have some sort of an idea of how to move forward. Related to that, then, all we have is the author's perspective. We don't have other person's responses to this. And so this is why I prefer the language of Matthew's Judaism as something we can debate whether it's a thing or if it's not a Judaism, rather than Matthew within Judaism, because it takes away the ambiguity of perspective. It's Matthew's perspective on their self-identification as Jewish and part of Judaism. Okay, so that would be one possible way forward. Also from the sociological literature on groups is the idea of groupness. And this is where I think we get close to the idea of sectarianism, as John brought up, as Andrew introduced fasting as possibly part of this. And I also saw it with the shepherd motif in Wayne's presentation and with election and this generation in Susan's talk. And that is that in literature, where there's a high level of groupness, a lot of self-cohesion is often in the context of conflict. And there's a lot of agreement in Matthean scholarship, as I understand, that the social context, as ambiguous as it is marked by a decent amount of conflict, as we see a heightened conflict between Jesus and, say, the Pharisees and Matthew in comparison to Mark. And so I think we can still ask those questions and say, yeah, it looks kind of sectarian. I would like to focus on the categories in the text and not to make the main focus that we're all talking about communities we don't have behind texts. Okay. The one quick note that's from Celia's presentation, you noted that nowhere in Matthew does it say not to obey the food laws. I also think that's the same in Mark. But even if that's not the case, even in the key text where Mark is thought to set aside dietary laws and possibly ritual purity laws, it's actually a question of whether they need to wash their hands before eating, because some of them appear to have already done it. This is Matthew 5, where the Pharisees question Jesus because some of the disciples are not eating without washing their hands, or they are eating before they've washed their hands. And so it doesn't seem to be a question of permissibility, but of necessity. Right. Real quick, I'm going to take 1 minute for this because Isaac also asked for me to talk about Matthew and Mark's relationship. Because my work is on Mark, how does our reading of Matthew's Judaism, I'm going to call it, change if we assume that his main extant source, Mark, is also depicting a form of Judaism? In the chat, there's a little discussion. To me, Mark has less groupness, less sectarianness to it. It's a little bit more sort of part of the discourse rather than trying to identify, to solidify its own group in some sense. But beyond that, I think if Mark is presenting a form of Judaism, Matthew is probably adjusting Mark in ways that suit his purposes, but not necessarily correcting a Gentile text for a sectarian Jewish group. I think part of the discourse of Matthew as sectarian text, at least in the older literature, I'm thinking of Overman and some of the early studies, was that it had to be sectarian because it was using Gentile Mark. And I think that changes when Mark is Jewish. I'm going to stop there because I think I'm already over 5 minutes, but maybe we can pick up some things in the discussion as well.
Thank you, John, for that very succinct, sharp analysis. We'll just proceed to Federico, and then with the time that remains, let's see how much discussion we can get going here.
Okay, thank you, Gabriele and Isaac, for inviting me. Now, I would like to refer back especially to some of John's Kampen comments, and by doing this, I will make some point on Matthew and the Q source. So, first of all, I completely agree with John when he says that it is very difficult to consider the study of Matthew except from a within Judaism perspective. And I will say that it is not only very difficult, but even inconceivable. So John is certainly right when he says that Matthew must be studied first and foremost in the context of other Jewish literature, and especially within the context of the halakhic disputes among the various Jewish groups of the time. One statement that I would qualify slightly, however, is when John says that an examination of Matthew's place in relationship to other writings from the early Jesus movement should only take place at a later stage, as this was something certainly to be done, but in the end of secondary importance for gaining a proper understanding of Matthew and his community. Well, this at least is how I understand John when he says that it's just not necessary to discount the use of Mark and even something like Q as sources for the author. However, here I would argue that it is actually of great importance, paramount importance, to relate Matthew also to the other texts of the Jesus movement as much as to the other rest of the Jewish literature, since most or even all of the other voices of the early Jesus movement should be considered expression of the Second Temple Judaism as much as Matthew. For example, Anders Runeson has observed how Paul, who traditionally has been understood as standing in stark contrast to Matthew, actually shares with Matthew some fundamental assumptions regarding the importance of Jewish ethnicity, the Mosaic law, the Abrahamic covenants, grace, and salvation, even though, of course, they develop these ideas in quite opposite directions regarding the question of how Gentiles should actually be included in the people of God. But leaving Paul aside, I would like to focus on the importance of the Q source, mentioned by John, for understanding the place of Matthew's community within first century Judaism. Several scholars of Matthew, such as Ulrich Lutz, Eugene Boring, and many others, believe that there was a close historical and sociological continuity between the Q group and Matthew's community. And recently, James McGrath, in his monograph John of History, Baptism of Faith, has devoted a chapter to the Q source that I find to be very convincing, where he argues that Q as a whole was written as a Baptist document. That is, I quote McGrath, a text composed to depict Jesus as John's natural successor and leader of his movement, and offering some of Jesus' teaching to make this point. End quote. So, according to McGrath, the Q people were followers of the Baptist as much as they were followers of Jesus. Now, it is not possible here to dwell on the reasons for this reading of Q, so I can only refer back to McGrath's book and also to my own article, John the Baptist in Q, in a forthcoming book on the early reception history of John the Baptist, edited by Joan Taylor and Nathan Shedd, which should be out, I think, next year. In any case, I believe that this assessment of the identity of the Q group has important implications for the Gospel of Matthew as well, because Matthew, among the four canonical Gospels, is certainly the one that, more than any other, associates John with Jesus on an equal footing or quasi-equal footing. From a narrative point of view, Matthew's Jesus continues John's preaching, repeating again and again his exact literal words. The kingdom is near, repent, you brood of vipers, every tree not bearing good fruit will be cut down and thrown into the fire, and so on. And again, in Matthew, John appears as the perfect partner of Jesus in relation to the gospel's central concept, that is, dikaiosune, righteousness. Both John and Jesus must fulfill all righteousness, and John came in the way of righteousness. So they are on the same side and accomplish the same work. In this light, it is entirely natural that the Gospel concludes with a missionary commission centered on baptism, that is, baptizing the nations and teaching them the righteousness of the Torah, of course, according to the halakha of John and Jesus. I would therefore like to suggest that the identification of Q as a Baptist document is also valid in relation to the Gospel of Matthew. So, to answer the question of where we should locate the Gospel of Matthew within Second Temple Judaism, my answer is that Matthew is, of course, a document produced by an apocalyptic and also sectarian Jewish group, as John Kampen has explained in his excellent monograph. But beyond that, I would add that Matthew's kind of Judaism, to take up the final reflection by Daniel Gartman on Matthew's original kind of Judaism, Matthew's Judaism should be more precisely belongs to the galaxy of the diverse movement of the heirs of John the Baptist, some of whom recognize Jesus as John's legitimate successor. This is the case of Q, of Matthew, the Gospel of John, while other groups among John's many heirs obviously did not. So I think this exemplifies well my claim that there is a lot of insight to be gained when we try to understand Matthew and his community in relation to the other texts and groups of the Jesus movement, of course, along the rest of the Jewish literature of the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Federico. I think now we have about 55 minutes or so for open discussion. And as Gabriele was alluding to earlier, we should perhaps first provide the opportunity for the panelists, if they want to interact with one another, respond to questions or comments that were raised, before we can widen the discussion to include others who are attending this event. Yes, go ahead, John.
I would be interested in further discussion about the question of Mark and my statement about reading these documents primarily within the context of Jewish historical documents, and try to explain what I'm thinking about and doing there. My concern is that even with those of us working in the within Judaism perspective, tend to understand the literature of the early Christian, and I hesitate to use the word Christian, the movement of the followers of Jesus in a fairly coherent, cohesive type of manner. And then to take our conclusions about the nature of that movement and try to place it within the context of other Jewish literature of the time. And I'm questioning that presupposition that and fundamentally, and I've done one article in the handbook of the Synoptic Gospels on this. The idea that the different Gospels or different interpretations in New Testament books don't come necessarily from some kind of dialogue with other perspectives within the New Testament and within the broader Christian movement. I don't want to limit that to the New Testament, but rather they are part of, that they are part of this movement of the followers of Jesus within a variety of different Jewish contexts and different Jewish situations, and the particular insights that a composition reflects can be seen to be derived from the particular Jewish context in which they were authored and developed, rather than seeing them as a response to some other, to elsewhere within the literature and perspectives of this movement. And it seems to me that this is coherent with our understanding of social movements in general. Times of social upheaval tend to be relatively chaotic, and they tend to grasp onto different leaders, different hopes, but they tend to be very diverse in how they grasp onto these signals of hope, how they grasp onto the type of leadership that's called for within, in this case, the context of imperial oppression. And so my concern is that we take, as in terms of understanding the nature of the work of the composition itself, that we take the Jewish context of that particular work, which admittedly is problematic to identify in many cases, I admit that, into consideration at least as seriously as how it interacts with other literature that the early movement of the follower of Jesus authored. And then to respond quickly to Daniel, and ask the question about the problematic statement about community, I guess I wonder, it seems to me the question you raise about community and literature is a much broader question that impacts our understanding of every document. Or is he suggesting that there's a particular way in which the question he's raising about Matthew and community is peculiar to our study of Matthew, or is he raising the broader literary question of the time period and how we appropriate those texts?
Thank you, John. John Kampen, that is, because John von Maren has raised his hand. So we'll let you chime in and then allow others on the panel to participate if they would like.
I very much agree that not assuming there's a little bit of more unity than is certain among the extant texts from the early Jesus movement, and first making connections between there is a great way to go. Partly because if you think about the number of years these texts are coming from and how much we don't have, we have just little nodes in this vast world of persons and all of their complicated identities and stuff. And so putting them in dialogue first or on the same level with other Jewish texts, I think is a great idea. It also strikes me that in certain cases, we have a relatively good argument for literary dependency. And I'm thinking Mark, Matthew, Luke. And so I do think we can talk about redaction of Matthew and Luke in sort of a unique way. And on kind of a different note, but on the same methodological questions, I'm a little wary of rooting these texts strictly in a Jewish context, because we do know that at some point a Gentile Christianity develops. And me coming from Mark again, but also Matthew, the consensus on Mark for the most part still is that it's a Gentile text and that it's coming from a different milieu. And so it's at least, if we root it strictly in a Jewish literary context, that's already a methodological point that isn't value-free. And I like it, but because, unlike the Qumran community, which doesn't have much of an afterlife and doesn't become this Gentile thing or whatever ethnic group you want to name, the Christian movement does, the Jesus movement does. And so we at least need to keep our feet in both sets of literature and both sets of ideas as at least a possibility. It's possible, as Matthias Conrad, for example, argues with Matthew, that it is kind of in a marginal space where boundaries are uncertain, and the community might not have known, and we can't evaluate whether the community knew.
Thanks, John, for that. Yeah, I really like keeping all options open in this setting, at least for us to brainstorm together and just echo what you're saying. In fact, I'm just wondering here as a general question before I see Dan has his hand raised, and I'll get to you in just one second, Dan. A general question for the panelists is whether it's becoming too evident that Matthew is a Jewish text or is within Judaism, or Matthew's Judaism. I think this nomenclature was very promising within Judaism or as a Jewish text for its probative value, for thinking in a different light about a text that was seen already for a while as extramuros versus intramuros. But maybe is this category becoming now too static, perhaps, for us, that it might lead us to neglect the Gentile, moving beyond the parameters of Judaism per se? So that's just a question there that maybe if anybody wants to respond to that or think about that later, I'd be very curious to hear your reactions. But we'll turn back to Dan, who has hand raised. Go ahead, Dan.
Couple of things. One, I think to John Kampen's, well, let me lower my hand here. To John Kampen's question, I think the things I raised about form criticism, I think they're not unique to Matthew and they're not unique to this question. But they are prolegomena to aspects of how this question is addressed in Matthean scholarship. The one of the main issues I want to return to with John Van Maren, and I think it's relevant. I thought about this before SNTS a couple weeks ago. We were talking about Luke within Judaism, and with Shelley Matthews and what we thought Luke was doing, and she asked me a question and whether I thought what Luke was doing was even Judaism, and I didn't know how to answer that. But I think I know with Matthew. So this question, and John, you mentioned this, Matthean Judaism. I'm not sure I like that, but Matthew's own brand of Judaism. Would we call that Judaism? And I don't know. I don't care what I call it, but Matthew understands himself as Judaism, as Jewish. There's some things in Matthew where he understands Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. We also, I think, need to recognize, and I think this is an important point, that we don't need to see in Matthew everything that the sum total of Matthew's understanding of Judaism doesn't need to be contained in 28 chapters. So there are plenty of things that could be his understanding of what Judaism is in his worldview that isn't in there. So what do we call? Do we say that Matthew is contributing to our understanding of first century Judaism? Do we speak of Matthean Judaism? I don't know. So I'm raising more questions than I'm answering. But I do think that we can speak of Matthew within Judaism, but what kind of Judaism? With John Kampen in his book on sectarian Matthew within sectarian Judaism, there's so much that I'm just right there, and where I go off the edge, maybe I go off the edge, or I'm just not on the same page, is Matthew's missional. And Matthew has a missions and outreach, and I don't think that Matthew's missional outreach is just for boundary maintenance. I think it's taken in its by at least by its early reception history as real authentic. We go make proselytes. We actually do it. This isn't just for us to say this is us and not them. It's not a boundary maintenance thing. It's a real, and as far as we know, the Qumran sectarian certainly had a concept for Gentiles, and Terry Donaldson has great discussion of some of this stuff, but in terms of but there's a lot of ambiguity as to whether it's theory or just it's eschatological theory or anything in reality. But there's nothing like Matthean missions in the Qumran sectarian material, and that's where I get lost on sectarian as a Matthean category.
Thanks for raising those really good questions. I saw Celia physically raise her hand and then virtually raise her hand. So we'll let Celia respond, and then Gabriele can follow after that. You need to unmute your mic, Celia.
One of the things that strikes me is that no one category contains everything. So can Matthew be a sectarian and still have a Gentile mission? Sure. I think sometimes we look to have a kind of clarity that is not possible, and a kind of an exclusive meaning to words that actually vitiates their usefulness. So in some ways, yes, I think Matthew is sectarian. And he has a Gentile outreach to bring people into his group. And is he different from the Qumran communities throughout that long period? Yes, he is. And but that is part of the diversity of that world. And so I think we can impose a kind of clarity and a neatness on any of these people. As much as it would make our work easier. And then what happens in his community and what happens to him in the subsequent decades, we don't know. And we just don't know.
Thanks for that. Gabriele.
Just a few comments also on the basis of a very interesting debate we had on the chat while you are presenting, making your presentations. From my point of view, there is no doubt that Matthew should be read within Judaism. And I think that the major reasons are the one that Jason Wendell has emphasized in the chat. Self-identity. I mean, we have an author that presents himself as part of Judaism, not as an outsider. So self-identity is a key factor. Second, we have an author that is participating in the debate in the Jewish debate of his own time, which is also important. I mean, is answering, regardless of a kind of answers that Matthew provides, is discussing the same questions that are discussed in first century Jewish, in other first century Jewish texts. So the fact of participating in the same debate is, along with self-identity, self-understanding, in my view, a key factor in defining the Jewishness of Matthew. Then I love what Federico said, and also then before, that the real question is not whether or not Matthew was Jewish, but what kind of Jewish he was, what kind of Jew he was, what kind of Judaism is Matthew's, because at the end, this is the real question. Exactly, even when we talk about Paul or Mark or any other of the earliest Christian texts, I think that, yes, we are addressing the question whether or not they should read within Judaism, but the real question is, what is the kind of Judaism? These are the really interesting questions. The question about John, that John raised about whether or not this is a more sectarian text than other Christian text, early Christian text. We can emphasize the sectarian character of Matthew in comparison to Mark, for instance, or Luke. And also what Federico said about the fact that this is a text that has profound connections with Q, with Baptist movements, and I will add also with apocalyptic literature, with the Book of Enoch. This Matthew is a document that has profound connections with first century Jewish literature and movements, regardless of the fact that then provides his own distinctive answers, which is what we expect from any Jewish text of the first century, to address the common questions and to give distinctive answers, because this is part of the diversity of Second Temple Judaism. So we don't have to define an abstract notion of Judaism in order to affirm that Matthew is Jewish, but we have to look at Matthew as part of a broader conversation, and broader and much diverse conversation that happened in Judaism in the first century.
But to go against the grain here, if I may, just for the sake of stimulating discussion, and also with this awareness that, you know, our discussion is being aired live on YouTube, and is going to be uploaded later on to the YouTube channel of Enoch Seminar. Somebody coming from the outside who's not part of this very specialized discussion, but is interested, because there is a great public interest, particularly on this topic that the Enoch Seminar covers. Yeah. Does Matthew ever identify as Jewish, or are we identifying Matthew as Jewish? You know, I'm coming back to something I raised in the chat, Matthew 28:15, this passage about the hush money, where the soldiers, it's unique to Matthew, right? They come to the priest and say how, you know, Jesus has essentially risen from the dead, and they pay money to silence the guards, don't say anything. And this is a story that is still told till this very day by the Jews. Is this like actually now an identification of another group, and we are not Jewish, they're Jewish, they're Jews, right? Where does Matthew say we're Jews, we're Jewish? I'd like to know that. It also maybe as a related question to that, if this passage appeared, say, in the Gospel of Peter, fortunately, we don't have somebody who's talking about the Gospel of Peter, but there are some interesting parallels with the Gospel of Peter and Gospel of Matthew about the tomb and the Pharisees and the Jews coming to verify that the tomb is safeguarded so that there won't be any rumors that Jesus rose from the dead afterwards. Would we be treating that passage differently and saying, oh, Gospel of Peter is outside of Judaism because it's not in the canon? I guess to what extent is the canon also dictating our understanding currently, given some of the points that Celia, I think, nicely highlighted in her presentation, post-Shoah, Catholic-Jewish dialogue, Jewish-Christian relations, etc. So I'm throwing a whole bunch of things out there just for us to think about. Are we taking some things for granted too much now amongst us specialists, Matthean specialists, or not? John, you had your hand raised earlier, so you probably wanted to respond to some other matters. So go ahead.
I could respond briefly to the earlier discussion, and would need a few minutes to think about these wonderful questions that you just raised, and respond to those. I was going to say that I guess in response to Celia's argument about the Gentile nature of Matthew, or to Daniel's, the missionary document, I'm not totally convinced about the particular Gentile orientation that is a fundamental argument of the work. My assumption is that that this particular composition was written or composed somewhere in a Jewish community that also had Gentile audience, and that was just a natural part of that world, rather than reflecting a particular total orientation about an argument for the inclusion of the Gentiles. I guess my reading of Matthew, and particularly the conclusion of the commission, I don't think Matthew goes beyond Isaiah 66. That fundamentally, in the eschaton, the nations are going to come and worship and gather before the Jewish God. And within the apocalyptic perspective of this Jewish group, their view of the eschaton is that's what will happen. And so if that's the case, then it's totally consistent between the mission of 10:5-6, go nowhere among the Gentiles. But when the eschaton comes, all are going to gather, and that statement of Isaiah is what lies behind those final verses of Matthew 28, when the nations will gather. And that's what I think is reflected in Matthew within the overall apocalyptic hope of this sectarian group. So I wanted to clarify that, but not totally sideline the discussion and permit it to go on to Isaac's important questions.
And no, thank you for that response. I don't know if other panelists want to participate, those who haven't talked yet. There's been a lot of chatter about fasting too, in response to Andrew's presentation. Andrew, you're not obliged, but if you wanted to vocally, I know you've responded in writing, but orally respond to anything that has been said. This is the moment for some further interaction amongst the panelists. Otherwise, we can turn to the attendees as well. There's a lot of interaction there too.
I think you all do raise excellent questions related to my suggestion about fasting. And I was just trying to emphasize, I think what's essential with noticing how Matthew mentions fasting is that to identify basically that this was an essential Jewish custom, which was very strictly related to the Jews. And I think that that's often been overlooked in research. And then just to see that Matthew picks up this theme, but then changes it in a different direction. And I especially appreciate Logan's comment that how can this be used as a social identity marker when it should be done in secret? My honest answer is I don't know. But I think even Matthew itself kind of wrestles with that theme itself when maybe later the disciples of Jesus are accused of not fasting and in light of Matthew 6. But I don't know, but I think though that what's interesting is to see especially the text critical questions that are later raised in Matthew. For example, in Matthew 17, where demons can be cast out only through prayer, and then later manuscripts add, and by fasting. Or Didache 8:1, which then it instructs new believers coming to Christ that on Tuesdays and Fridays, I think, and maybe as a group you should fast. And I think we can even see in these other early Christian texts, even conflict with Matthew's instructions about possibly using fasting as an identity marker. And it may not have been only this conflict within early Judaism, but as early Christian texts argued and wrestled with this theme, maybe to see how it was led to these other thoughts. But thank you all for the comments.
For Matthew, Jews fast, Gentiles have fun.
Exactly. Yep.
Anyone else? Any other thoughts here amongst the panelists? Celia, go ahead.
I keep forgetting to use the little virtual hand, but this is just a clarification of a clarification. To go back to John's comment, I wouldn't disagree with you about, do I think Matthew's project is total outreach? No, but I think it's there. And I do think it is within the apocalyptic and eschatological vision of Isaiah 66 and other apocalyptic texts.
Right, thank you. We can come back to Andrew.
One thing I forgot to mention, and this relates more directly with Gabriella's point about, and I'm also convinced by this as well, that I think Matthew clearly should be read as a Jewish text. And I think maybe to go against Daniel's comments that basically, does it really matter or not? I think, yes, it does matter. And I think though, what maybe we should also consider when we read through Matthew is what role, or what we should ask ourselves, what role does the continual conflict with the Jewish authorities maybe have on our interpretation of Matthew's Jewishness? I don't have the answer to that, but I think because it reappeared throughout Matthew, it should at least be considered within our attempt to answer this question.
Yeah. I'm wondering, I just speaking out loud here, coming back to this category of Jewish versus Israel or Israelites and the work of Jason Staples, but also even before him, Daniel Boyarin. Boyarin is very reticent to use the term Judaism for pre-modern periods and even the term Jew. And instead, maybe we need to speak of Israel. We have these distinctive passages in the Gospel of Matthew, only go to the lost sheep of Israel, right? Don't go to the Samaritans, which might imply that in the eyes of the author, Samaritans are not Israelites, even if they did consider themselves to be Israelites. So should we say Matthew within Israel instead of Matthew within Judaism? Throwing that out there as well. Wayne, I was very intrigued by your presentation. I'm wondering how you deal with the passage in Matthew about the parable of the vineyard and it being transferred to another ethnos, right? Because in your presentation, you were talking, it's not a replacement of Israel, right? But I guess of the leadership. So how do you interpret that passage?
I mean, the short answer to that is the passage itself at the end kind of tells you in that, oh, the leaders are, oh, he's speaking against us, right? So that's how I would, in a short, respond to that. It's the leaders that are being replaced with the Mattheans, who are the successors obviously Jesus, and then when Jesus is gone, the Mattheans are the successors and who the Israelites ought to be following.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Yeah, I'm thinking Anthony Saldarini had dealt with that passage in an interesting way, pointing the range of the meaning of the term ethnos. But I'm also wondering whether we have to now rethink these passages in light of how Mark is being understood, if Matthew is depending on Mark. I'm not taking that for granted, actually, John von Maren. All options are on the table. I'm an agnostic when it comes to the synoptic problem. But if we're now reading Mark within Judaism, right, and then Matthew, usually since Papias has been claimed to be a Hebrew text, at least, that what is going on here with the redactional activity is a question that intrigues me. Susan, in your presentation, I think that actually, if I understood correctly, and there's a lot of things going on here for me as one of the chairs with the chat feeding with texts and messages that I'm receiving behind the scenes. I think your impression is that the state of Matthean scholarship is more divided than what I'm insinuating, where maybe I was implying, oh yeah, it's a given. Matthew's a Jewish text, Matthew's within Judaism, but that wasn't the impression I got from your presentation. Was I correct in my impression there?
Well, I would say that Matthew is within Judaism.
Okay.
But there is that element of mission to the Gentiles that I think is an active mission. And I do agree with what John is saying about the Great Commission being a fulfillment of those apocalyptic expectations. But again, it seems very active that Matthew is leading, his audience to be actively engaged in bringing Gentiles into, his communities, or, I hesitate to use the word community because it always seems to be used for that specific community, but into his group, so to speak. So, so again, I think there's tension in Matthew, and there's no question in my mind that he's Jewish. There's no question in my mind that it's very rooted to Judaism. However, there is this process that I feel like he even uses his document to kind of say, we are moving into a new kind of community that's going to include Gentiles. And I think he sort of is paving the way for that.
Thank you.
In any
Yes,
case,
Gabriele.
yeah, of course, it's a form of Judaism that includes Gentile. I mean, the two terms should not be taken as opposite to one another.
Correct.
There are also other forms of Judaism that were thinking of including Gentiles. I mean, Hellenistic Jews were including Gentiles in their own communities, but nobody is questioning the fact that they were a form of Judaism. Apocalyptic forms of Judaism were John mentioned Isaiah, but also the tradition of Enoch were thinking of including Gentiles in eschatological perspective, and nobody's questioning that were forms of Judaism. Of course, then we have also something that we are discussing also in the chat, and there are other people also in our audience that could come and bring their point of view. I mean, Staple, for instance, Jason Staple, for instance, is also interacting in the chat. Obviously, we have also a problem of the language that is used in Matthew. I mean, who are the Judaioi in Matthew? Who are the Jews in Matthew? I mean, the passage that you are referring to, Isaac, is it talking of the Jewish people? Is talking of Israel, or is talking of a certain group in Israel? I mean, we have the same problem also with the Gospel of John. So the fact that the author is talking about the Jews as somebody else, as outsiders, does not necessarily means that he's talking of all the Jews according to our own language. He might talk of a certain group of Jews, a certain kind of Jews. I repeat, for me, the fact that the Jewish identity of Matthew and the fact that Matthew is so closely part of the questions that are the common questions of first century Judaism makes a strong point in affirming the Jewishness of this document. Of course, this does not mean that Matthew was a Jew like everybody else, because there is nothing like a Jew like everybody else. Matthew is part of a distinctive group within Judaism, so the two things goes together. And again, we are back to the question, what kind of Judaism was Matthew promoted?
What about this passage? I know I already brought it. I don't want to overdo it. And actually, Anders is just here. So maybe, Anders, you can also answer this question and pass on. I'm insistent on this point about the hush money passage, as I'm going to call it today, where, they're saying the Jews, they have this story, they're saying, up until this day about what actually happened with the empty tomb. Welcome to Anders, by the way, who has just joined us and was saying some things in the chat panel right when I was actually thinking about you, Anders, vis-a-vis what Susan brought up with the inclusion of the Gentiles. That we need not necessarily view these in opposition to one another, but I guess the question also is the terms of entry, right, for the Gentiles, rather than the inclusion of the Gentiles. What are the requirements for them to join the movement? So there we go. Anders, yes, go ahead.
Thanks very much, and thanks for reminding me. I just arrived, so I might have missed a few things. So if you have already talked about this, please forgive. But I saw in the chat also the comment on Judaioi in Matthew and a short discussion of that, and then the rumor that was spreading that was brought up too at the end of the gospel that this rumor is still present among the Judaioi, etc. I think there are ways of talking about Judaioi in two different ways in Matthew, and one of them would be what. I think Franz also had this in his commentary on Matthew, namely that in that last passage, it really means Judeans, like in the geographical sense. And that's supported, I think, by, at least in my reading, that there's a very strong tension between the Galilee and Judea in Matthew's gospel. And so it's not like the Galileans' fault that this rumor is not spread among them, but among the Judeans, it is. So I'll just throw that in, and we'll see where that goes. Thanks.
Okay, all right. Paul Sloan actually has his hand raised. I don't know if Megan, if you could bring Paul Sloan to the panel, that would be great. So, just give us 1 second here. In the meantime, if anybody else wants to.
The quickest thing, Paul, I've said it so you can talk if you want, but I will look at also adding you to the panel.
It's okay. I don't need to be added to the panel. Audio is great. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thanks, Isaac. It's a really good question. I had started to type it out, and I thought it might be better to say it so y'all can hear my tone in it, so it didn't come across as sharp in the chat. So one method I kind of use when someone raises a question like this, which is a good question, is to ask how he could have or would have said it differently, and if that would have then led to a different conclusion. So you ask how he could be within Judaism or even identify as Jewish with that claim. But if he's a Jew wanting to say this about something that's happening among his fellow Jews, how else might he have said it? Maybe he would have said it differently. But when I just assume, okay, he's a Jew wanting to say this is happening among his fellow Judeans or fellow co-religionists or whatever, this seems like a perfectly reasonable way to say that sentence. And so in and of itself, it doesn't seem to compromise whether he's a Jew or not. Also, I mean, I don't know, you get statements like this in the Maccabean literature, Josephus, where they're talking about something that some super, you know, wicked priest has done, leading someone else in, and we would say that those are Jewish texts written by Jews where they're saying something pretty critical about, even related to money, about money and injustice or something, about their fellows. So in and of itself, it seems like it wouldn't compromise that. But it's a good question. It's really a methodological point. I ask myself, how else would he have said it? And could he have said it in a way that didn't lead to this conclusion? So to me, it doesn't actually compromise the overall thing. But I mean, it could. It's one of those texts like the one you already raised that Wayne Baxter answered really succinctly and well, I thought, about how do you interpret the ethnos thing. You're like, well, the text interprets it this way, so that's good enough for me. Anyway, that was all. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. Just although picking on the very last point, I did see Jason Wendo in the chat who has provided a lot of feedback, interesting questions. If Matthew depends on Mark, and so does Luke, it's interesting that Matthew adds in the word ethnos and Luke doesn't, and Jason was wondering about that question. As far as I really appreciate, Paul, your response to my question with the reference to the Judaioi in Matthew 19:20, was it Matthew 19:25? Forgetting the exact reference here. It's later in Matthew. Just to stimulate some discussion here, me being one of the culprits for reading Matthew as a Jewish text, I always wonder, nevertheless, about my arguments and where are the weak points, where, could I sharpen or even review my opinion, revise my opinion. So that's why one of the reasons why I was asking for that question. Appreciate that.
No, it's a great question. Thanks. I'll mute now and assume that I'm not on the panel anymore. Thanks.
Gotcha. We have maybe another 5 minutes or so to interact with a few more comments or questions among the panelists with issues that have been raised in the chat feature before we take a break so we can set up the shop here for the next panel that will start in half an hour. Is there anything else? There's something I'm missing here and not seeing. Yes, Gabriele.
Gabriele, I have a question for John von Maren. You said that Mark, Matthew and Mark are both Jewish texts, but if I remember correctly, you said that in your opinion, Mark is less sectarian than Matthew. So I would like to repeat my question. What do you mean by sectarian? Okay. Because now the term sectarian is not a term that defines Jewishness. I mean, Matthew and Mark are. So now we are discussing which kind of Christian Jewish text is less or more sectarian. Okay, so I just wanted to know. I would just like to know why you say that Mark, in your opinion, is less sectarian. What it means sectarian?
Yeah. I don't really know. I think I like the language of a high level of groupness. So group cohesion, sectarian works too. And I guess what I'm thinking of is especially Matthew's use of ecclesia, like a specific term for the group that has seems to have institutional associations. And also the code of conduct or how to discipline members in some of those chapters that Matthew has that Mark doesn't have. There seems to be more of a communal sense about the text. And Mark just doesn't have some of those. I don't want to make too much of that, but one way, if you want to see more, the other factor then is I think Matthew heightens the conflict at many points between Jesus and his followers, and especially the Pharisees and others. Which fits with a kind of group hunkering down, making themselves into, focusing on themselves, high levels of differentiation between them and others. And so that would fit with Mark as kind of a time when things are more fluid, less immediate conflict, maybe just more part of a wide variety of persons who are Jewish on my reading, but haven't really formed clear marks of the like clear differentiation beyond just like Christ following and not Christ following, but other things in addition to that. That's kind of as vague as I would want to remain on that. And then those are just sort of the thoughts in my head, as especially spurred by John Kampen's presentation today.
Thanks.
I'm sorry, Gabriel, did you want to say something in
No,
response to that?
No, it's just thank you.
No, it was just in the chat. I brought it up. I'm wondering whether, community with versus sectarian. These are two terms that we need to define or think about in a different way. For purposes of analogy, and there's always risk with anachronisms when we come to the contemporary scene, but consider the Jehovah's Witnesses as one modern day movement that is viewed as sectarian or has been viewed as sectarian from the wider Christian world, but yet probably views itself as Christian or the true Christians and reaches out, knock, knock. Many of you must have been visited at least once by a pair of Jehovah's Witnesses. And I'm just thinking about that with respect to Matthew, sectarian in some way as being, we've some presenters here that have talked about on the margins, because of their messianic beliefs in Jesus, but presumably there's some kind of outreach or hope that their movement will expand beyond the confinements of wherever they may be located, versus community. At least community for me in the context of Matthean scholarship makes me think of conversations of provenance. Where was this gospel written? Was it written in Galilee? Was it written in Antioch? And then we're trying to recreate the life of this community on the ground based on very little evidence, right? So those are two things for us to have to think about further. There is one important question that I saw in the Q&A. It's a different box than the chat box, and I apologize. I'm only noticing this right now. And it's brought up by Bernadette Bruton. And this is for the panelists, so I'll just read it. How do the panelists interpret Matthew 27:25, which is the verse in Matthew that has led to the greatest persecution of Jews? And we ought probably not to gloss over that question in the panel on Matthew within Judaism. I don't know if anybody has the courage or desire to confront that verse. Anders, thank you.
Sorry, there's the audio. I'm not sure I have the courage to come with, there's no final response to that one. But I do think that a lot of the arguments around that passage has taken laos as some sort of indication of the whole people and so on, but and not only like a smaller group, but laos is not quite used in that way, neither in Matthew nor elsewhere in Greek. So I would suggest a very simple interpretation in the context of that passage, of the greater context of that passage, and that is that this refers to the Jerusalem group of people who has gathered there before Pilate as Jesus is supposed to be judged. And in favor of that, I think you can also see the entrance into Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem a little bit earlier. You can see a differentiation between those in Jerusalem who have no idea who he is, but whereas the people coming with him declare very clearly with the very famous putting on clothes and stuff on the ground and proclaiming who this person is. So there's a distinction between those who have followed him from the Galilee, as it says in 19:1, 2, 3, and then the Jerusalemites who have no idea who he is, and then has no relationship to him, and then are easily persuaded there at that passage. So that would be my response. But I do think that you cannot use laos as an argument to differentiate that from ochlos.
You would confine Matthew 27:25 to the Jerusalemites?
Yes.
His blood be on us and on our children. It's not the entire laos of Israel, the people of Israel, but to the inhabitants of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
That's how you read it.
Yep, that would be, and there are scholars who have read this in different ways also in a sort of a much larger picture, that has also in terms of atonement some possible ironic almost implications.
Okay, thank you for that. Susan, you had your hand raised, and it'd be great if you could address this question if that's what you wanted to do.
Yeah, my primary, I want to agree with Anders. First of all, I think this is limited to a group of individuals who basically join the Jewish leaders in their persecution of Jesus. And I think Matthew goes out of his way to show that the leaders are influencing more and more people to join them in this persecution. And so I think this ties back to Matthew 23 and the blood guilt upon this generation. And so I think specifically this is referring to a smaller group within Jerusalem, and is not saying all of Israel. Certainly Matthew could have said that in that way, but specifically trying to highlight the fact that people are joining the Jewish leaders in this persecution.
It's wonderful that we're reading this in such a nuanced, specific, contextualized way. If only, our comments can reach the widest audience possible, because certainly out there, that has not been the way this passage has been read. Celia, you might actually have the final word on this because of time, simply because we want to have enough time for the organizers to prepare for the second panel, but please do not rush in your deliberation.
This is not to the point of 27:15. So if you want to finish, just close off, then please, you can skip this.
It doesn't have to.
Back,
Go ahead.
This is back about outreach. And as we were reflecting and talking and debating, it occurred to me that maybe we can look at this, if we're looking at Matthew as a leader in conflict with other, we're looking at him as trying to establish his own authority as the correct interpreter for his community. We can look back at 23, verse 15. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, for you travel through the sea and land to make a single proselyte. That's often, how should I say, overlooked. However, many Jewish scholars of early rabbinic texts regard it as reflecting something that doesn't show up in other literature about Pharisees, and we've got so little written evidence that it's hard to tell. But perhaps he's talking about an outreach as over against his opponent's outreach. And that might just kind of loosen up things here about whether this takes Matthew outside of a sectarian group or not.
Oh, thank you for that. And one of the takeaways from what you just said, which resonates with me, is looking at Matthew as some kind of documentation that provides us evidence about Jewish practices and beliefs that otherwise we wouldn't really know much about, namely here the question of proselytism. So on that final note, I just want to thank all of the panelists for their presentations, to the presenters, to the discussants for their feedback. I apologize for mispronouncing names during this session at a couple of points. We're going to stop here because the organizers need to take a little break before we set up for the next panel, which will start in 18 minutes on James and 1 Peter. So please do stay for that. And in the meanwhile, enjoy the rest of your day, evening, wherever you